Hello and welcome to this webinar on disability criticism and the state of the conversation in biblical studies and the ancient world more broadly. This was organized by the Society of Biblical Literature, and this panel would not have been possible without the initiative of Benny Liu and the work and technical support of Latoya Leary. My name is Candida Moss and I work at the University of Birmingham in the UK. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and in addition to working on disability in ancient texts, I am also disabled. I want to begin by giving just a little bit of background for those viewers who may not be familiar with disability studies. Disability studies and critical disability theory emerged roughly 40 years ago in departments of literary criticism among scholars shaped by feminist studies and Marxist philosophy. It was buoyed by activists whose work reflected the sheer diversity of human experiences that count as disability, and often focused on the distinction between a physical impairment and its reception in wider society and culture. It trickled into our own discipline in the past two decades, and thanks to the pioneering work of scholars like Rebecca Raphael, Jeremy Skipper, Hector Avalos, Nyasha Jr., and many others. There is now a growing conversation about and ever-burgeoning interest in the representation and categorization of disability in ancient texts, the archaeology of disability, the intersection of gender, disability, and race in our sources, metaphors of impairment in our traditions and theology, and the ways that traditional interpretations of scripture marginalize and exert power on people in the present. Simply noticing the presence and interests of differently abled individuals really changes how we read the Bible and ancient literature. The importance of these questions, to me, has perhaps never seemed more relevant than right now during a global pandemic that has revealed systemic ageism and ableism in society at large, and even in the corridors of the academy. As some, namely privileged, healthy, mostly white Americans and Western Europeans, begin to declare an end to the pandemic, while others, mostly but not only in the global South, remain at risk, it is apparent just how much our definition of ability is shaped and formed by geography, politics, social status, and privilege. I am enormously grateful to this group of thoughtful and talented speakers for their willingness to volunteer their time and in many cases sacrifice their sleep to be here today to share their insights as leaders in this field. I'm going to introduce them briefly before we get started with our conversation. I'd like to welcome Candace Buckner, who holds a PhD in Ancient Mediterranean Religions from UNC Chapel Hill and teaches at the Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University in the United States. Chris DeVette, who obtained a D.Litt in Ancient Greek from the University of Pretoria and teaches at the University of South Africa. Louise Goswell, who holds a PhD from Macquarie University and is based at Mary Andrews College in Australia. Eric Harvey, who obtained a PhD from and continues to work and be based at Brandeis University in the USA. And last but not least, Isaac Soon, who earned his PhD from Durham University in the UK and is about to begin teaching at Crandall University in Canada. I should note that while we respect and honor the academic degrees and titles that we have all earned, for the purposes of creating an egalitarian conversation, we have agreed in advance to address one another using first names. And with that, we'll finally get down to it. So I want to begin by putting aside the kind of academic fiction that we're these sort of disembodied minds that work in these little vats on this topic and ask you all about your journeys to this point. So I wanted to know how you came to focus your scholarship on what I'm broadly calling disability studies and biblical interpretation. What was the field like at the time? What kinds of questions or experiences helped you focus your answer? And what attracted you to it? And I want to begin with Candace Buckner.
Hi, so it's actually really funny because I started this journey, I think, years ago when I was an undergraduate, and I was working under Professor Michael Roberts, who is now retired from Wesleyan University, and I wanted to work on saints' lives. And so I started writing a final project on that topic. And I realized by the end of it that I didn't want to stop writing it or stop writing on the topic itself. And that led me to apply to, graduate school. And then fast forward into, I would say 2017, when I was working on my dissertation, which as anyone knows is, a pit of all the things. And I was reading The Coptic Life of Afu, and I got to this quote, how can you say of the Ethiopian man that he is the image of God, or of someone who is leprous, lame, or blind? And I was just like, that seems very problematic. What has anyone said about this? And then I was fascinated because I went and, something that I was like, well, I need a footnote on this because I can't talk about this piece of literature without mentioning how these discourses on disability and race and ethnicity have suddenly collided, as if they're the most common categories in the world to put together and we should all just accept it. And so I went looking and I realized that by and large, people had just kind of been like, oh yeah, the ancients, that's what they do. These are all really similar. Let's talk about the other things in the text. And I was just like, but I want to talk about this. We should be talking about this. In part because, for one, as a modern reader, it's jarring. On the other hand, we can see how these sort of discourses remain relevant to us today. This is I'm reading at the beginning, right, of like the Black Lives Matter movement. I'm reading at a time when people are debating about disability studies is not only its place in the academy, but also what we should do about legislation. This is also during a time when we were getting to a point where there's an administration who's very critical of giving people their access based on disability rights. And so I'm like, wait, we should, this is a moment where like we can say, hey, there are sources from the ancient world that talk about these problems and talk about the ways in which we think about bodies that remain relevant for now. And we should be talking to our students about this and we should be writing about this. And so that's what really brought me to like this topic. And then I was like, oh, this is a side project that is not a part of the dissertation. This is bad. But then I was like, we have to do what we have to do, right?
Thank you so much. I really appreciated that. I think pit of all the things resonates with many of us. And I loved your emphasis on the relevance of the work to today, which I think even if people aren't invested in the ethics, there's the fact that our departments are under threat. So even if you don't have good feelings about this, staying relevant is surely just on a pragmatic level important to you. I wanted to follow this by asking Eric Covey for his story, also because he has this beautiful website where he engages many of the kinds of questions you were just talking about, Candace.
Yes, thank you. And I just want to say, like Candace, a lot of good things come out of footnotes grown too large. And that's sort of my story too, is I never intentionally set out to engage biblical texts through disability criticism or critical disability theory. But when I was 1 or 2 years into my coursework in my PhD, I received a diagnosis of retinitis pigmentosa and learned that on some unclear nebulous timeline, I was going to lose my vision and become blind. I had always been low vision in the sense that I had had a visual impairment that had restricted some privileges. For example, I'm never blind or I've never driven, but was not never hit the legal threshold of blindness until about 2014. And then I really started realizing that this was something that was going to affect how I researched and how I lived and how I identified for the rest of my life. And so I set upon this journey of discovery and started reading all sorts of blindness literature and disability theory, everything from academic work to memoirs to political activism and advocacy texts. At the time, I was reading the works of people like Georgina Klieg and Stephen Cosisto and John Hull, Martin Millikan, just for my own personal journey of grappling with what this transition in embodiment and identity meant. And at the same time, I was writing my dissertation. So this is several years on now, in 2017, 2018, writing my dissertation, which is a transmission history of the Egyptian Hallel Psalms across about 2,000 years of history, from their origins in ancient Israel through the end of the manuscript period in early modern Europe. And within this section of Psalms, there is the famous line, they have eyes, but they do not see. They have ears, but they do not hear. And as I disentangled the many occurrences of this line through not only those Psalms, but other parts of the Bible, you find that this line recurs really often and means wildly different things. And there is only one occurrence where in Isaiah 43, it is changed from they have eyes but do not see, but it says bring out the people who are blind, but though they have eyes. And so I started disentangling and pulling the threads apart of meaning here, in terms of what changes in the different contexts of this line and what changes in the different formulations of this line. And it really made clear to me that most of them had nothing to do with disability per se, but were often sort of imprecisely or without much consideration analyzed through the lens of blindness and deafness as disability, whether it was appropriate to the context or not. And that led me in two directions that were, again, like Candace, not particularly relevant to the larger dissertation, but you have to do what you have to do with some of these rabbit trail projects. That led me into looking historically across the reception of this line and the ways in which later developments in its interpretation and use were read back into the original formulations and occurrences in the Hebrew Bible. And then, looking elsewhere in the ancient Near East, for example, and looking at the metaphorization of blindness specifically across cultures in Mesopotamia and Egypt, and really finding, surprisingly, that, for example, in Mesopotamia, blindness is not used as a metaphor for anything, almost at all. Which, considering the ubiquity of blindness as a metaphor in contemporary usage, really in every language family on Earth, presents something of a surprise, and is something that I'm now working on in a new project on sort of blindness as lived experience in the ancient Near East and as it existed in the cited imaginary in the ancient Near East.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting. And I definitely want to return to some of the issues you raised there. I too didn't write my dissertation on this and then got led astray like Eric and Candace, but some of our participants did write dissertations concretely on disability. And so I want to tend to them. Louise, perhaps you'd like to go next.
Sure, thank you. It's lovely to be part of the panel. Thank you for having me. So for me, I became interested in disability through personal experience. So in Australia, here in Sydney, where I'm based, I had done a 3-year theological degree, and I was about to commence a 1-year honours thesis. And at that time, I was trying to decide a topic to write on for that thesis that I thought would sustain my interest for a whole year. And in the middle of this contemplative process, I received a phone call from my mother-in-law, and she was quite distressed at the time because my 16-year-old brother-in-law had been stepped down from ministry in his church because he has Down syndrome. So while the previous minister of the church was supportive of my brother-in-law's participation and his role in serving, so he would do things like welcome people at the door or carrying candles for liturgy, a new minister, when he started, said that people with intellectual disabilities are unable to identify themselves as followers of Jesus because they don't have the capacity to understand the Bible. So his reasoning was that people with intellectual disabilities shouldn't be allowed to represent the church in any kind of way, even if that's just welcoming people at the door or carrying in candles. So I realised that in 3 years of doing a theological degree, not once was disability mentioned. And I find that staggering really in retrospect, given the global statistics on disability. And so I started to look into this topic and I thought, I think this is what I'm going to do for this research paper. Literally thought I would race through this, plow onto a PhD straight away. Didn't quite happen. Thought I would move on to a different topic, but I just find, even all these years later, we've moved forward in a lot of respects in disability studies and the Bible, but we still have a very long way to go. So I'm still very much committed to this topic.
Wow, that was a lot to unpack there. Just watching Chris's face was quite the treat, I have to say. And yeah, I don't think the ironist thinks that most of us can understand the Bible. So, I guess we're in good company. Isaac, perhaps you'd like to go next.
Yeah, sure. It's great to be here. I'm a relatively recent kind of addition to the field of disability studies. So I feel, especially as a newly minted PhD, a little bit like it's still new to me. But I think I kind of stumbled into the topic and into the field and to taking seriously the lived experiences of people with disabilities in 2015 when I moved to England to pursue graduate work. I had just kind of become a father, and being at Oxford and being a new dad in a new country, there was a lot of balancing those types of things had a huge effect on my body. I started gaining a lot of weight. I started losing all my hair. And so for me, I had come to Oxford wanting to explore aspects of epistemology or theories of knowledge in the New Testament. And in relation to specifically Paul's visual appearance and his body. But when I started reading, I was frustrated by how much people would kind of use aspects of Paul's body or the work of other people or the work of or the figures of early Christianity kind of as just a launching point to talk about other things, like Eric was talking about before with the metaphoricization of disability, and it kind of being a waypoint to actually talk about, well, what's really important or kind of these social values or things like that. But I had remembered, actually, Louise and I shared the same supervisor, so Jim Harrison, and who helped her as well. And so I remembered her work, and so I kind of started exploring the way that scholars in biblical studies had approached embodiment and the body. And the first kind of thing that I came across was disability studies. And of course, Canada, your work, and numerous people that you mentioned earlier on. And so as I started kind of reading more into the field and reading the work of different scholars, I realized how epistemological and how not just useful, but just how powerful the stories and the thought and the philosophy from people with disabilities was for understanding how knowledge is generated. And yeah, so I mean, when I came to my PhD, I decided to continue my work there with Paul and epistemology, but this time kind of shifting. Well, what if we think about, everyone talks about Paul being a disabled apostle, but what does that mean? And so my supervisor at the time, Jane Heath, she suggested, well, what about disability? And of course, by this point, Louise had finished her PhD, and you know, Canada, you were working on your book on divine bodies, and so, and of course, Louise Lawrence's work on senses in the gospel, and so there's a kind of a rising tide, albeit small, in the New Testament studies with thinking about disability. And for me, I realized, well, actually, this using and thinking with the various disability studies literature out there, thinking with this literature with Paul, I found it to be really, really productive with Paul in a very not just a fruitful way, but a way that kind of re-embodies Paul, not just kind of a kind of a walking brain who kind of spouted off theological things, but just as a person, reconstructed or constructed, whose body had significant things to tell us about their identity, but then also could be useful for critiquing our own presuppositions about the text and ideal bodies today.
Thank you. Chris, would you like to share your story too?
Thank you. Yeah, I feel a little bit out of my depth here with all these wonderful scholars doing such wonderful work on disability studies. And yeah, I'm glad to hear that I'm not the only person who did not do a dissertation or a book on disability per se. So my interest in disability studies and ancient health issues overall actually came via my research on slavery, which was very interesting, because when one works on slavery, so my approach to slavery is very much influenced by French liberal philosophy, particularly Michel Foucault, Merleau-Ponty, Bourdieu, and several other French philosophers. And one of the questions when one deals with slavery, of course, is you have questions of freedom, of autonomy, of corporeality, and biopolitics and citizenship, all of these issues. And what's interesting is, as I progressed in my work on slavery, the issue of disability kept coming up in some way. So much so that when one reads the texts from these perspectives, that you cannot, and I think this might have been the case with many of us, that you cannot ignore. You cannot ignore it. So, and specifically, my interest was on aging and old age and ageism, and how that intersects with disability. So it was really via that and wrestling with concepts of freedom and corporeality and embodiment. And it's interesting, and it's significant enough, I think, to point out that many of us have been almost, I don't want to use the word naturally, but we've been sort of led into disabilities by the way we approach our texts, by what we read and what we do, and the questions we ask. And I think that's a significant point to make. And I find it very interesting that, because I sort of thought myself to be a bit of an outlier, because I came in via slavery, but it seems that many of us has done that. And what I sense is that many of us are doing what Foucault calls writing a history of the present, and writing histories of the present, approaching our histories and historiography with really very important issues for today. So that's how I got into it as well.
Thank you so much. I hear some emerging themes already that we could touch on during the rest of our conversation. I sort of want to return to something that Eric said about discovering that blindness is not used in this metaphorical sense in every community. And it seemed to me that one of the things that he's doing in this new project is disrupting the quote unquote instinctive metaphors, I heard someone say recently, with which people think. And of course, metaphors aren't instinctive. That's not a thing. And that's one of the ways that I think disability studies can contribute to our field and our present, as Chris was saying, by kind of disrupting the normalcy of our own kind of bias and prejudice. And so, Eric, I was wondering, in thinking about that, what is your sense of what's exciting, other than your own work? What do you find exciting in the field right now? What do you think's limiting as you work on this new project?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that is exciting about the thinking through biblical text with some of these very thoughtfully and rigorously produced definitions and frameworks of disability is that it does help disentangle, very different uses of not only whether something like blindness appears as a metaphor, but its specific metaphorical entanglements, because neither of those two things is necessary or straightforward or self-evident, even though that phrase instinctive metaphors, even though it as you say, metaphor is not instinctive, but it can be very intuitive to the level that we almost cease to interrogate it. And we can think of some of those metaphorical entailments as necessary and transhistorical. But really, I really very much resonate with what Chris was just saying about writing histories of ideas, because, or rather what I've sort of done and what I'm working on right now is writing the history of a certain phraseology as it passes through different contexts and helps create different ideas and work to inform or reinforce or challenge certain ideas. And I think this is one reason, this is one area where biblical studies is particularly important in that writing of the history of the present, and in it can be a very important site to challenge sort of some of those knee-jerk or intuitive uses of scripture that have been central in meaning making for so many people. And you can find so many cases where one particular interpretation of a text is taken as straightforward and self-evident, when really you can trace this pattern, this process of this line that I'm talking about. They have eyes, but they do not see. They have ears, but they do not hear. Starts in Jeremiah, moves through the Psalms and Isaiah. Then Jesus picks it up and really riffs on it in a very innovative interpretation, let's say. And then that is then picked up in later Christian interpretation, and particularly in the medieval period, in the construction of this anti-Semitic trope of the blindness of the Jews, in terms of their resistance to conversion to Christianity. And then you still see vestiges of this, or not so well hidden vestiges of this in critical scholarship, when you see discussions of the moral or spiritual blindness of ancient Israel. And so understanding, disability theory as it intersects with metaphor theory as these texts travel through time, can help us understand when certain anachronisms are being read into the original, Israelite or Judean context, and can sort of disrupt some of those easy and problematic associations between disability and anti-Semitism and racism and all of those things that still tend to plague our contexts of scholarship.
Yeah, Eric, I also think that there's a certain amount of like ubiquity of familiarity happening, because we are familiar with one text and we're familiar with the language of that text. We might assume when we look at something else, for example, if you've read the New Testament and we talk about Jesus and his healings, right? We might assume that this might be the standard by which we should understand all other such healings later on. And then you realize, wait a second, we live in different contexts. We live in different moments in history. So we are taking for granted that someone in the ancient world, from my perspective, would think the same way that we do. And we just know that's not true, right? We know that's not true. And would use language in the same way that we do. It's even though they might be reading some of the same texts, they're certainly not reading them in the same world. And so I think part of what we have to do is acknowledge that we as modern people are familiar with the language. And so that obscures us to what might actually be happening in the text. And so that's part of, I think, one of our, jobs as scholars is to say, this is written in a historical moment. We ourselves have our own history of reading or understanding. And how does that confront the realities of this ancient text, right?
That's a great point, Candace. I mean, oh, sorry, Eric, do you want to continue?
Oh, no, go ahead, Isaac.
Well, I was just thinking, like, one of the most difficult parts of working, I guess, with disability studies and biblical studies right now is, because the ancient language can be so difficult to kind of critique. Oftentimes when I'm presenting to people who aren't specialists in the field, I constantly having to prove first principles. What defines disability? Kind of having to self-justify like why this approach to the ancient world isn't anachronistic, things like that. Even some basic things that within, I guess, disability studies or the disability community more widely would be taken for granted. For example, the relationship between disease and illness, thresholds of disability. How chronic does an illness have to be considered a disability or something like that? And so I think, yes, we've got to remember that we're living in two different horizons with the ancient world and not assume just because we translate a word as disability or impairment or things like that, or various, according to various medical taxonomies, that we're not necessarily talking about the same thing within the same framework. But one thing that I find limiting right now in the field is that just kind of constantly having to redefine or define for other people, because we're both having to shed light on the ancient texts, but then also change the way people think about bodily ideals and bodily norms, and what Canada was talking about, what some people think is kind of instinctive.
I found it interesting when I first started my PhD, I had to do my first presentation at uni to let people know where I was up to. And I found it ended up in this whole discussion exactly as you've said, Isaac, about why we should even be talking about disability in terms of ancient texts. And it was fascinating, actually, how many people said to me things like, this is a 20th century concept, so of course it's not there in the biblical texts, or the Bible doesn't even have anything about disability in it. So it's really fascinating the pushback that I got. I agree with you about why you had to justify looking at this topic, how it was a legitimate part, or why it should be a legitimate part of biblical studies at all. But it was really fascinating as well then to see over time, scholars come back to me at the university and say, oh, now I realize how many references to disability there really are. Wow. Or things like, I didn't realize how much it impacted the way we think about other references to the body throughout the biblical texts. And those assumptions that we have that every reference to a body is a normative kind of body. And that's what's so helpful about disability studies, that it does help us to interrogate those assumptions that we make about representations of the body in the biblical text. So I think one of the great things and the exciting things, going back to your question, Candida, is to see that progression in biblical studies and to see it being able to end up in dialogue with a whole lot of different other areas and not just sitting as this distinct category on its own as it keeps moving forward. That's been a lovely thing to watch, I think, over a period of time.
Yeah, I tend to agree with everyone. I think on the one hand, what's exciting about biblical studies is that we are seeing slowly but surely some wonderful methodological innovation and multidisciplinary, because disability studies is as many of you have shown in your work, is in essence a multidisciplinary aspect or study or field. It's multidisciplinary, and it's also an intersectional. It's also highly intersectional. That was something I picked up in my work with slavery and seeing disability and ageism, is that you really can't just see it on its own. It always intersects with gender. It always intersects with race or ethnicity. It always intersects with something that makes it even more multidisciplinary, which makes it complex. But I think in biblical studies, there is on the one hand these methodological innovations taking place, and one can see it in scholarship. But on the other hand, I think the limiting aspect is the other side of the coin, that I think there is still, and I'm hearing what Isaac is saying about the frustration of language, Isaac. I mean, I had that experience with slavery, that I felt that there are these things that frustrate us, you know, and I pick it up when I teach, because I teach at university, but also at churches and other venues, and people, you can see something's bothering them, but they don't have the language, they don't have the discourse. And it was like that with slavery, and I sense that same thing with disability, as you were saying. So, and in biblical studies, I think what is still a little limiting is that there is still a lot of what I would call methodological foundationalism that tends to hamper us a little bit. It tends to hold us back. And it becomes a structural and almost an essential problem of language and discourse. So I really feel your pain. I really get it.
Absolutely. And I think in the vein of, you know, having to convince people that disability exists in biblical texts, or that biblical texts have some concept of disability. You know, I think the study of disability and antiquity does really offer some important ways to, you know, nuance and complicate the 20th century history of the development of the term and the discourse around disability in terms of, you know, what holds disability together as a concept. Why was it formed in, you know, in the context of industrial liberal democratic society, and what things hold and don't hold across history. So you know, while on one hand we may feel a little like we're pressed to defend applying disability criticism to biblical texts, on the other hand, you know, you find these situations where the theory as developed in disability studies proper doesn't quite fit the ancient conceptions, because they really don't share those industrialized liberal democratic that milieu that informed the creation of disability as a category and as a political coalition. So I think on the one hand, yeah, it can be frustrating to have to defend that, but on the other hand, there is also room to show how the ancient texts can inform a broader, more nuanced understanding of disability.
What I'm hearing you talk about a little bit, Eric, is sort of the ways in which thinking about disability, which is, it feels like it's frustrating. We're still needing to have to explain what this is. And it's enlightening that people say that they don't see disability in the text, but then they do apparently see race and gender in unproblematic ways. You know, that's a really interesting contrast to me. And I'm hearing you, Eric, starting to talk about what we contribute to this discipline, what it allows us to discern and attend to that we otherwise might not discern and attend to. And is there more to be said about that? I'm hearing a lot of people talk about intersectionality, both Eric in your work on anti-Semitism, Candace, your work has been so important for me in thinking about the intersection of race and disability, and of course, Chris, in talking about enslavement, we're talking about that kind of social status and disability and age and the ways in which they include one another. But I sort of want to direct this question to Isaac, because your work on circumcision sort of highlights the intersection of disability and ethnicity in the ancient world too. And I was wondering if you had more to say about what we contribute to the field.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can get us started with my work on circumcision. So in my thesis, I argue that circumcision from a Greco-Roman point of view can be understood as an impairment in disability. And something that I realized early on, like a lot of you, was how intersectional disability was. And as a way of kind of holding together numerous different things like ethnicity and also gender. So when I was working, I had a colleague at King's College, Grace Emmett, who was working on Paul and masculinity. And we kind of, our research kind of converged when we were talking about Paul's use of gendered language and ethnicity and male physiological traits, male genitals. And we kind of realized, well, disability studies and gender studies were kind of both kind of talking over each other, but not necessarily realizing that they were in the same conversation. And so I think one aspect of disability studies is that intersectionality and the way of holding together a lot of different concerns, gender concerns, ethnicity, queer concerns, post-colonial. I think there's a lot of potential there. And I think two other aspects that I can think of, I mean, Eric has already mentioned it. One in his own work is kind of critiquing the kind of ableist or ableist biases and questions and interpretations that arise from particular texts. So, as a relatively recent like kind of public ally for people with disabilities and disability studies as a field, I'm very conscious of the ways that I reproduce that kind of ableism and the stigma and the kind of barriers towards people with disabilities. So I think with disability studies and in biblical studies, one of the things that it's helped me, I mean, I've been recently reading through Disability Visibility, a kind of edited volume by Alice Wong, and just reading every single day a single story of lived experience of the struggles and the victories and the agency of people with disabilities. It reshapes the way that I think about ancient texts, and it not only critiques my own biases and the kind of things that I bring to the table, but it also, I look back on some interpretations of various disabilities or physical aspects in the New Testament, and I'm sometimes just absolutely mortified, like, oh my goodness, like, how can we actually think like that? And I think that, that's something that Eric brought up before. One thing in my own work that I kind of emphasize that disability studies brings to biblical studies is kind of this move beyond kind of diagnosis and only merely viewing disability in the New Testament as kind of, what kind of ancient medical condition was this? For example, with Paul's thorn in the flesh, scholars have mined, every tiny little aspect, this word, this sickness, this encounter in Galatia, this angel of Satan, what is this? And so many different theories. It's malaria, it's epilepsy, and it's kind of focused on diagnosis. And I think there's nothing necessarily inherently wrong with that, because I think for people with disabilities today, part of their life is kind of navigating this kind of medicalized discourse. the kind of medical hegemony that bears on kind of classifying their bodies. But what I've witnessed in New Testament interpretation, at least with diagnosing disability, is this kind of the interpretation stops at the diagnosis, because that's all that's fruitful. So, well, we know what Paul's condition is, let's kind of move on. But I think that's obviously very reductive, as a lot of you have talked about in a lot of your own work. It's actually, the impact and the kind of agency that these conditions and these bodily differences actually have on the very text that we're reading, and the effect that they have on us as interpreters, even without people realizing that it's happened. So I think those are just some of the ways that I see the contributions of disability studies and disability theory to biblical studies.
I think that's also, Isaac, really important in the sense that because I do slightly later, so late antiquity, it becomes even more prevalent when you think about the fact that we're talking about a world in which most people don't read, right? Their encounter with these texts is always filtered through someone else's voice in some way. So if you think, for example, about John 1:9, the story of the man born blind from birth, and how that gets then picked up by later people like Jerome and Chrysostom and others in their homilies, which they would have been giving to congregants who more than likely would have been living with their own bodily conditions that would have impacted their lives, and then realize that this is the sort of thing that they would have heard time and time again every time that they stepped right into a church in the ancient world. They would have heard a sermon that at some point would have talked about a bodily condition in a way that metaphoricized it, allegorized it, and yet been living with some conditions themselves. Or on top of that, they would have looked around and seen the artistic program of the church, and also seen those stories retold about healings, about how to understand these bodily conditions within this context. And then you realize there's a whole entire society of people who are being told how to read their bodies, how to understand them, how then they should interpret their own daily bodily experience. When Chrysostom says that we should just deal with pain because this is us dying as a daily martyr until we actually die and then are rewarded with no pain. What does that? How does that translate to his audience? How does that work? Who, as I like to say, he's always involved in the hard sell. Who is convinced? How does that reintegrate the way that they interpret their own daily experiences of life? And I think this is one of the great things about thinking about biblical studies and reception history. If you know how the story begins, and then you can see how the story gets used, you can talk about how that shifts, how it changes, and how that impacts, right, the way in which people daily move through the world.
Wow, that those comments by Candace and Isaac, there's just so much good stuff in there that I wish I had time to talk about everything. But there's a thread there that's coming up to me about representation of reality that really ties into the work of Rosemary Garland Thompson in her book Extraordinary Bodies, and some of her later ruminations on feminist disability criticism, and talking about how representation seeks to convey reality, but it also in turn structures reality, and then thinking through issues of gender and disability. And Garland Thompson, I think, interacting with Audre Lorde's work, talks about the rolelessness of disabled women in texts often. And this is something that I struggle with in my interpretation of biblical texts, since so many of the discussions of blindness in particular occur only in the masculine. And that there is this lack of awareness in the text, even of women who can be disabled in ways other than barrenness. But there's another thing also about representation that is I've been working on in the Mesopotamian context, because one of the really spectacular things about the Mesopotamian textual record is that you uncover not only literary texts that were copied and recopied because of their literary value, but you uncover these massive archives of entirely quotidian documents, financial records, ration distributions, agricultural records. It's like someone in several thousand years digging up an accounting office from the 1950s or something, where everything's in paper and filing cabinets, and you find these details of real lives and lived experience, and how that you can start to connect how that reflects or doesn't reflect the representation of disability in literary texts. And so there's this fascinating dynamic in Mesopotamia where you find blind people living and working in all parts of society, all these different sorts of jobs, and yet they are largely absent from literary texts, sort of with the exception of this one famous myth called the myth of Enki and Ninmach, which deals with the creation of humanity, and then two gods get in a drunken argument over whether if one of them creates a disabled human, if the other one is clever enough to think of a position in society for it. And so it goes on like this, and they find jobs for all of these people in society, and it's a strange story, and it's unclear whether it's supposed to be comic. It comes off as comic in a way that's kind of troubling, but at the same time, it points towards something that we don't get in many biblical texts, which is the productive place in society for people with disabilities. That is, that there is a possible good future, a good life for them that does not involve the possibility of a cure. So yeah, I just wanted to bring up those points on how representation both reflects, but then also structures or fails to reflect realities of lived experience. And also to put in another plug, as Isaac mentioned, for the book Disability Visibility. It's an excellent volume.
I think one of the other ways that disability studies generally contributes to biblical studies is that it pushes back against a lot of existing stereotypes that exist. And I think it pushes back against I don't know, a predisposition towards the erasure of disability in translation and interpretation. I think, Jeremy Skipper's work on the imagery of the Isiatic servant and the erasure of that disability language in our translations is really helpful in that respect. I wrote about the parable of the banquet in Luke 14 as part of my PhD dissertation of my Morzebek volume. And what I found fascinating about that passage is how quick interpreters are to jump to the language of the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame as being metaphorical language. And, when I've talked about this in lay context in churches, but even in the academic space as well, people are so quick to say, this has nothing to tell us about disability at all, because this is clearly metaphorical, allegorical. Everybody knows that this is the case. How could you even try and think that this might have something meaningful to say about the place of people with disability, historically or, in the church today? And, I've tried to say to people, what reference is there for using disability to refer to Gentiles, because that's the way it ends up being allegorized. Oh, that it's just that's how they're talking about the Gentiles, the nations. Everyone knows that this is the case, but what reference is there? There isn't actually anything from the Old Testament, or there's no precedent to give us a concept of that's the way a first century hearer of Luke's gospel would have heard those texts and said, oh, clearly this is an allegory about the Gentiles, but it fits our narrative of our interpretation of Luke's gospel, this kind of replacement theology. It fits our narrative there. So we want to then read into this metaphorical interpretation. I think disability studies forces us to look more concertedly at imagery of the body and imagery of disability, and makes us think differently to actually interrogate it for what it says, rather than jumping to this idea of erasing it or making it become a metaphor or an allegory. And I think there's so much depth that we can get from our biblical texts, because we then ask a range of different questions from the text than we do if we just kind of swallow the traditional interpretation of these passages.
I think what if I'm listening to everyone and what I'm hearing, and this is also my thought, I think so we would say that reading the Bible through the lens of disability, well, let me say reading the Bible and reading biblical scholarship, because it's not only about the ancient texts, but the scholarship needs some deconstructing and revision. That I think is the big thing, that's a big task that lies ahead of us. But reading the biblical texts and biblical scholarship through the lens of disability studies helps us to almost read against the grain, doesn't it? And when we approach these texts and the scholarship about the texts from disability studies, we can perhaps clearly see some of the normative and normalizing strategies in ancient society, sure, as I think Candace was pointing out. But inevitably, when we do that, we also see these expositions of power, these fissures in society, these social insecurities in our own society. And I think that's why people become uncomfortable and why people get nervous, because it becomes a bit of a mirror also to us, I think. And that's why it's such a valuable tool. I remember when I was undergraduate theology, Louise, similar to your experience, I was taught in New Testament 1 that you must always perform exegesis and never perform eisegesis. You must always read out of the text, never read into the text. Nowadays, I teach the opposite. I tell people to do eisegesis, please. Bring everything you are into the text, everything you have, all your baggage. It doesn't mean we must do anachronistic readings. It doesn't mean we must do irresponsible readings. We have some guidelines, but we must bring our bodies essentially into these texts, and then perhaps we could see scripts that we usually didn't see. My experience was, one of the moments that was sort of a moment of clarity for me was when I started working on asceticism, and I think Candace would be able to relate because we work on similar concepts in late antiquity, is that disability is a type of an ascetic script in a lot of these ancient hagiographical literatures. And what to do with that is fascinating. It's quite challenging. And so I think that's really the value. I mean, the question is, could we ever do biblical studies without disability studies again? That is perhaps, for me, the main thing, because it will not be the same again, I think, after this.
And I think too, just adding to that, Chris, I absolutely agree with you. But you realise, as a New Testament scholar, you think about how significant body-related language is to the presentation of Jesus and the Jesus followers. How can you possibly consider that language of the body without actually thinking about the images of disability? You think, for example, the whole message of the incarnation is about God dwelling amongst human beings in a human body. We talk about the resurrection of the body of Jesus, the resurrection of believers in the body. Paul describes, the church as the body of Christ. So we've got so much body-related imagery that's so integral to the New Testament that I think it makes so much sense for us to, as you say, that language of reading reading your body into the texts, which I think we've undervalued in the past. Yeah.
Yeah, if I can just briefly say, I mean, it's so true, and we've been speaking about metaphors quite often, but I think we should remember there's no such thing as a mere metaphor. These metaphors do things, you know, they have very, very tangible effects in society. You know, it's very relevant.
I'll go for Candice.
Okay, I was just going to say, I also think it's interesting that we're talking about reading our bodies into the text. I think historically everyone already has. We just haven't acknowledged it. This is part of, and I think this is part of the issue, right? We read this text and we're like, well, why did so-and-so look over this? And so-and-so looked over it because it didn't matter to their experience. And I think that is also a part of this. It's like the acknowledgement that people already historically, scholars already historically have written themselves, has centered their concerns in these texts, and we talked about it as if they haven't. And that's something that we need to like actually confront also in the scholarship, this idea that somehow we are disembodied minds who write about things, when in fact we're not, right? And that has too left another legacy in the way in which we as scholars have approached texts or try to like push back against the reading of text.
And I think when we problematize reading only a singular type of body out of those texts, and I think that's what it can feel like, it's reading against the grain. But I feel like a lot of interpretations that approach or take disability seriously in biblical texts actually come up with better exegesis. I mean, I'm thinking of Candida, your piece on you know, the woman with the flow of power. I mean, if there was ever like a lightning bolt moment for me that completely changes the way that I read a text, it was that article. And that was for me a huge kind of turning point of thinking, oh, actually, well, this is not just, I mean, yes, we're reading ourselves into the text, but this is not kind of eisegesis. This is actually a really, really good reading of the text. And I think that's something significant there too.
Yeah, I think both of those contributions were very important, and I want to just add on top of that not only have people who are able-bodied read their own bodies into the text, but due to sort of the hegemonic nature of able-bodied interpretation, it has also trained people with disabilities often to read an abled body into the text as well, and sort of to elide or dismiss parts of their own experience that really cause sticking points with those aspects of textual interpretation, where really taking seriously those embodied lived experiences do, as I said, lead to better exegesis. And so I think, you know, one of the things that disability studies has done for me is it has given me language and sort of an awareness of areas where, you know, I might be tempted to elide my own experience in reading the text and to comply with a prevalent able-bodied interpretation of a given text. So I think just reading in disability studies has freed me up and given me new capacity to engage myself in the text and to point out areas where, you know, I can ask things like, why am I not in this? Where do I fit in this text? You know, reading, you know, some of the utopian visions of Isaiah and saying, you know, is this utopia inherently eugenicist? If there are no blind people there, or, you know, the work of Jeremy Skipper there, comparing that with the ingathering language of Jeremiah and other parts of Isaiah, you know, bringing the blind and the lame in from exile with the rest of the people. And then of course, Canada's work on disability in the resurrected afterlife. There are those questions that just pop up now that are unavoidable as I read, you know, where am I in this text? What is this what does this imply for me? Does this text have a position for me or for people with other disabilities?
Thank you so much. This is such a rich conversation, and if I may, like, sort of insert a kind of new thing for us to think about, in listening to Eric and all of you talk about centering able-bodied and able-bodied readings and the kind of despotic tyranny of these kinds of readings, I wanted to, I think it's not only the case that disabled people are reading themselves out of the text, but the way that we encounter these texts and the way we think about disability might too be occluding and erasing other kinds of marginalized bodies. In particular, I think about the ways in which the use of enslaved workers as prosthetic devices in antiquity sort of erases some of the disability, but the disability also erases those bodies. So I was wondering if we could, even though we're trying to sell the world, or at least the Academy, on thinking about disability, think about the kinds of bodies that we might be erasing in our reading. If that's not too challenging a question to raise in this context. And I don't think it is, knowing some of all of your work. I can pull on Chris if necessary, given all of your work on enslavement.
Yeah, Candida, I think that is really a very relevant point. This and particularly, well, with enslavement and how slaves, I mean, particularly building on some of the work of Jennifer Glancy, the wonderful work that she's done on slaves as bodies, but slaves also become sort of surrogate bodies. So their bodies tend to represent the bodies of the owners, and what the effects of what it comes at a cost in terms of our reading and interpretation, and what we are erasing from the text is a very interesting question. With regards to slavery, one of the major challenges that I've had just in working with slavery is that people say, well, you know, it was such a natural thing. It was such a natural practice. Everyone accepted it. They couldn't think outside of the scheme of enslavement. You know, and in my first book, I sort of challenged this idea to say that, well, ancient people could not think, you know, they were unable to see slavery as immoral because it was so natural to them. I came under criticism in some reviews because people said, well, you're too hard on the ancient people because they couldn't think differently. And I wonder whether we don't face similar challenges with regards to disability, that some people could say, well, almost everyone had some sort of disability in antiquity, you know, whether it was from war or whether it was from poor healthcare. I mean, if you break an arm or a leg today, you go to the hospital if you have that privilege. Not everyone has that privilege, and they fix you. But I mean, in some of they fix you, you know. But in some of the developing countries, bones of children are broken on purpose at a young age in order to make them disabled, so that they can beg and raise money for the poor. So I'm sometimes a little worried that this type of erasure, that sort of saying, well, everyone was disabled, so almost no one was disabled, that is a challenge we have with slavery. And I'm not saying it is the issue with disability, but I wonder whether it could not also be an underlying problem, that it might be so common and so natural that we tend to miss it. I don't know if that answers the question. That seems like rambling from my side. I apologize. Maybe others have better questions, answers.
Chris, I think you're touching onto an important point there, which is that, you know, sometimes disability can seem so broad, where it's obscure, right? How can we do it? I find a little bit of the opposite sometimes, maybe coming from spending some time in the classics literature, which is that the erasure happens because people approach disability and impairment in the ancient texts from only kind of medicalized categories, from the things that we've considered disabilities today. So, and I think the thing with enslavement in the ancient world is that, well, we think, well, that's not a disability today. So then, or it's widely thought that it's not a disability today. So then why would it be in the ancient world? But I think when you understand the kind of social and cultural effects and dynamics with those, with bodies which are made deviant, which are denormalized, to use the words of Anne Waldschmidt, I think that starts to expand our categories beyond just kind of the medical categories that we consider today, the conditions that we consider to be disabilities today. And of course, it comes under criticism to say, well, isn't it just so, as one of my examiners said, wouldn't it just become so saturated that it becomes useless as a kind of analytic category? But I would say, I'm willing to put up with saturation if it means that we can think about these bodies that are really, really on the margins of the margins, and to help us critique our own biases. But then also, as Eric offered earlier on in our discussion, that the ancient world and the discourses of disability there have a lot to offer. Contemporary discourses and definitions and frameworks for how we conceive and conceptualize disability.
Yeah, I mean, just to add very briefly, the notion of in slavery studies, the notion of utility has become quite central. I mean, we speak of ability and ableism and ableness. I mean, ancient slaves were, according to popular ideas, not able to be virtuous. Does that make them disabled? I don't know. That's something we can talk about. But in slavery, it's also a matter of it's a matter of usefulness, of utility. And one of the saddest texts I read was a story about a slave, an old slave who had worked so hard for many years that through labor he had become disabled and he couldn't work anymore. And the natural thing for the ancient writer to say was, what do you do with a slave like that? You get rid of him.
Yeah, that intersection that Chris brought up, the intersection between disability and aging is one that I think is generative. I'm working with a little bit right now. In terms of there's a dynamic that I've seen both in ancient texts and in modern contexts, which is that aging is correlated very highly with disability. I saw one activist talk about ageism and particular elder care and elder care institutions are a disability issue because nobody goes into an elder care home just because they are old. They go in because they are disabled through age. And so you see there is this deep connection, not entirely necessary, but a deep connection between aging and disability, at the same time as you find in not only in modern contexts but also in ancient texts sort of a reticence to use disability identity language to describe disabilities acquired through age, and this is true for blind people. People who lose their vision through age often have a lot of trouble identifying or shifting their identity to being a blind person, or using language of blindness to describe themselves. And this is something that happens in biblical texts too, where you find circumlocutions for age-related vision loss that don't involve use of the Hebrew word iver for blind or any of its derivations. So there's also that intersection that where the use of different language reflects the intersection of two particular identity locations.
I think that comes up particularly with which texts get picked at picked up in antiquity as something that are worth exegesis, right? The man born blind is picked up in part because we expect, right, when people age, for them to lose their sight to some degree. But the man being born blind is not simply a medical crisis. It is an ontological one, because the question becomes, then how can he know God, right? Like there's a whole, at least in the minds of late antique interpreters, right? And so this moment where people are navigating or attempting to navigate these identities as they collide become moments of, I think, textual frustration. And we can also see this, at least in my text, when you have the idea like, oh, later on when they get older, it's not so much an issue, or if this is an issue, if you're of a certain class, as Chris has pointed out, you get a slave, right? A slave will now do your reading, right? A slave will do your writing. I now have a slave who can help me with my mobility issues. What does that mean? So now there's a world in which we have enslaved prosthetics who then help people navigate their daily lives. And this is something that, if you read, right, the literature, we sometimes get little inklings of, like when we read Paradise Lost, and we're aware that someone has written this text, at least the end of it, because the author himself has gone blind. He's no longer able to see. And so, thank you, Milton. But like, this is one of those moments where it's, we get inklings of that when there are mentions of how certain people get help. But then there's the reality, okay, what does this mean for the enslaved person as they age? What does it mean for people who cannot afford slaves or not of a certain class to have slaves? What does it mean for the person who, for example, there is a lovely article, and I'm blanking on the name right now. It was written by someone who was talking about basically someone in Roman Egypt who was partially blind, and he was a landowner, but his neighbors started picking off areas of his land because he was partially blind. So then he petitions the government to get his land back. And he talks about how, you know, his neighbors have set upon him and other things. And then eventually this particular scholar followed this guy after he got, you know, permission from the government to get his land back and all of these things. But eventually he does go fully blind as a result of age. And we're left, we don't know what happens after that. We don't know if his neighbors, who were kind of predatory, stole the rest of his land, if he was able to maintain, or any of these things. We're just kind of left. And besides that, we get no indication of how he navigated his daily life with his partial blindness and then his full blindness later on. And so there's no, and so in this sense, we do get that kind of erasure because we want to know both the outcome of what happened. I will say in the interim, in the middle, the government was like, you should get your land back. This is unacceptable. So we can say that. But at the very least, we still don't know like what happened in the middle, how this man navigated his life on the daily basis, and how that changed, as you guys pointed out, as he aged.
That's a really interesting example. I love that kind of set of papyri and the way that papyri let us see glimpses of people's lives in that way. And I wonder what it would tell us about something like, you have the paralytic who's born by 4 people to see Jesus. They dismantle the roof, which seems like a pretty aggressive thing to do, let the man down, and Jesus says, take up your mat and walk. Like he wants him to carry it. Is that person wealthy? Are the people who bring him enslaved? How does that contrast with the man by the pool of Bethesda in John, who can never get in the water in time because he has no one to help him? And so you kind of like have these sort of contrasting models that people aren't really thinking with, but the example that you just gave, Candace, was like really illuminating. One of the things that I've heard a number of you mention is that when we were in grad school, we didn't write dissertations on this in part because we didn't know that we could. I personally didn't know that disability studies was a field. And that leads me to wonder about like, how can the field of disability studies sort of find its way into biblical studies? How can we be more intellectually inclusive? How can we be practically more inclusive in welcoming people into the guild? And how do we want to see the field move like over the next decade? And I was wondering what Louise, who does a lot of administrative work and probably thinks about these kind of practical questions, thinks about this in particular.
Yes, I'm definitely wearing my Dean of Students hat when I'm answering this question here. As I was contemplating this question, I think the step for me really is thinking back about the way that we do education across the board. You know, I think I've definitely seen a growth and development, at least here in Australia, in terms of greater diversity in biblical studies. You know, I've certainly seen more scholars of colour and more Indigenous scholars. I think there's been a few more disabled scholars here in Australia, but it's a really slow process. And I really do think that the way that we teach theology, the way that we teach biblical studies is very one size fits all. And what ends up then happening is the kinds of people that are coming through theological education, coming through graduate school, fit this one size fits all approach, and they're the ones who become biblical scholars. So we're just reproducing scholars that look like the scholars that they've learnt from. And at some point, if we're going to make a difference about who ends up in the guild, then you actually have to change something somewhere along that lines. And I think the starting point has to be what we're doing in theological education. We have to move past a one size fits all way, I think, of teaching that allows for people with vision impairments or someone with mental health condition or whatever it is to be part of that classroom and fully immersed and fully inclusive, which then will have an impact on who graduates, who goes on to do PhDs, and ultimately who's writing in the field of biblical studies. So I feel really strongly that we need to move past we stand at the front and we lecture at students kind of approach to education. That is really the standard approach to all tertiary education. But what happens when we shift away from a one size fits all approach and we want to say, let's look at pedagogical models like universal design for learning, which is about saying, let's be more inclusive. So let's alter the way that we teach to try and be, you know, to think about the fact that we have people of different learning styles and abilities within the classroom so that we can cater to all of those, including the people on the margins, instead of just saying, well, this is the way that I do it. And if you don't fit in my box, well, obviously you're not cut out for it. Because I think there's lots of people who have the potential to go on and be great scholars, but who don't fit the box that we have in theological education. So we're cutting off a pathway. And I think if we open up that pathway from the time of tertiary education, then we can have an impact in who's going to end up in biblical scholarship. So I think it starts much earlier than just who's doing PhDs and who ends up writing. But I think it has to happen at, you know, right from the beginning of who's actually doing theological studies in the first place. And dare I say it, perhaps we need to dismantle our ivory towers a little bit. You know, I think we have this really precious approach to, well, unless you can write a good exegesis and a good essay, you can't be in our field, you know. But, and so if you take away some of that, if you ask your students to write more personal reflections, then you're not going to have the same kind of academic rigor. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think research being done in universal design for learning is really critiquing those ideas. Just because you do something differently doesn't mean it's wrong. It's just that we've got to think differently to the way that we've always done this particular model of tertiary education and theological education in particular. So I just had a chapter published on universal design for learning and theological education for students with and without disabilities. And so this is where I'm really tuned in at the moment in trying to think about how can we do this differently as we're actually teaching our students.
I guess speaking from a US perspective, I would say that like by the time you get to college, at least undergrad, if you're doing things like ancient or biblical studies, it's a little late, right? if we think about just the linguistic rigor that we ask our students to have, and how many secondary schools, high schools have access to, say, Latin or Greek, right? And then you get people coming into undergrad and they, for the first time, get to choose what they want to learn. And maybe they want to learn things that represent them, which hasn't been promoted in K through 12 education. And so this is actually a question of, what do people have access to? How do we as a field model what we have to offer? How do we change the sorts of requirements that we think are completely necessary to participate in the field? I mean, how do you convince someone that, okay, you've not had access to ancient language or any language in K through 12, now that you're here, I need you to learn Latin, Greek, and then maybe Hebrew, or then maybe Coptic, or then maybe Syriac. How do you convince them of this? Instead of say, oh, speaking as a person of color, I don't want to take the African American Studies course on the 1950s that talks about something that, say, my Black soldiers' involvement in Korea. That was my grandfather's life. How do you model a classroom experience that says to the student that they're going to see themselves in what you're teaching? And I think that's one of the things that's really difficult and can be really hard, especially when students look around and they see a model and they see that that model isn't them.
Yeah, this is a question that I could really talk about for hours, because there are so many levels to the creation of a more inclusive biblical academy. On the very basic level of research, there is the problem facing blind scholars in particular, and blind students, of access to information. And this is something very relevant to me as someone who wrote his entire dissertation never looking at a page of print. I haven't read print on a page since 2015, I think. And so, a lot of the arguments that go on about print collections versus digital collections have increased stakes to me as someone for whom the print collection is totally inaccessible. Up until a few decades ago, they talked about this phenomenon of the book famine for blind people, because the production of Braille books in large quantities is cost prohibitive and space prohibitive, and you can't stock libraries with them in the same way you can with print books, and so the improvement of digital technologies has made life totally different for blind students and blind scholars, in terms of access to digital books, in terms of text to speech. There were several very successful blind scholars in biblical studies and theology in the last generation but they had to have any book they wanted read and recorded for them on cassette tapes. So and there are still a lot of practical problems to solve in terms of distributing and accessing information through different types of technological mediation. There are these problems of digital publication standards and citation that are relevant to everyone in the field as we start to read more EPUBs, that don't have standard pagination, and make us sort of reconsider these very basic questions of, why is it our convention to cite informational structure by the structure of a normative artifact, which made sense when you had huge print runs, but doesn't make sense when you have books as repositories of information being transmitted simultaneously through multiple media. So there is increasing work to make scholarship accessible to students who want or need it. I think there is a lot of cross-disability solidarity work that's necessary, because just as able-bodied academics or administrators or people, in broader society don't understand a disabled scholar's particular access needs, there's no guarantee that someone with a certain disability will intuitively understand the access needs of someone with a different disability. And this shows up occasionally in divides between, sensory disabilities and motor disabilities, which have different sets of access needs. And then, there are other types of disabilities as well, including, hypersensitivities or cognitive disabilities or chronic illnesses, chronic pain that lead to different sorts of barriers and access needs. Another thing I think we need to discuss, and this is relevant really broadly outside of disability, but intersects with it in important ways, are academic labor conditions and labor standards writ large, and especially the way that precarity intersects and interacts with disability in terms of how being precarious makes life hard on disabled scholars without access to healthcare, and then often how precarious labor conditions can cause or exacerbate nascent disabilities in scholars who enter the academy able-bodied. We need to talk about the parameters and frameworks of academic positions and the expectations, the cult of productivity in academic labor. All of those things need to be reassessed and radically restructured to make an academy that is more inclusive to people with disabilities and people from a wide variety of different backgrounds and with different needs and abilities and contributions to make to scholarship.
I think Eric's point about employment opportunities for biblical scholars with disabilities is a very, very important one. I mean, I have a number of colleagues who, even if they live in countries that offer healthcare, their disabilities, have restricted, the kind of impossible publish and perish goals required for academic positions these days. And we do need a serious solution. I've heard about, kind of co-teaching positions, which I think is a really interesting way to think about it, dividing a singular position amongst two different people to kind of to accommodate and to remove the barrier. Because it's, I read a Twitter thread from a disabled humanities professor last night, and they're saying, well, in the few of us who go through graduate programs, we make it through in spite of the system. It's not because the system enabled us. And then by the time we graduate, there's a whole nother barrier, which is trying to get employment. And then if we do get that employment, that's a miracle in itself. So I think thinking about the barriers that people with disabilities face in biblical studies with employment, I think that's a really, really serious thing that I would like to see SBL address. Another thing I think is also just the economic layer to this aspect, which for graduate students, especially living in the US and in countries that don't offer the same kind of healthcare as other countries, it is prohibitive and restrictive to constantly be offering exclusively scholarships and things like that to able-bodied people. I mean, so I would love to see, kind of an SBL scholarship or something like that set up to really fund up and coming scholars with disabilities who are working in biblical studies. It doesn't have to necessarily be even disability studies, but just if we're serious about inclusion and diversity and the importance that having different perspectives in our society is about, then I think putting our money where our mouth is an important aspect. Another layer, if I could just take a bit more of your time, is just the architectural layer, which is, so my study in the UK, I mean, both at Oxford and Durham, prestigious places, but I distinctly remember in Oxford literally climbing the spiral staircase up to my supervisor's office, literally climbing the ivory tower and wondering, how is a wheelchair user, for example, supposed to access this office? And then someone might say, well, they could just meet them in a different place. But, if you're studying at Oxford, you're studying biblical studies, and every other student from undergrad to master's to PhD is meeting with this one professor who is the head of the whole department in this area in their office, and having tutorials there and having discussions there, that's an access problem. And that's a serious issue. Even in Durham, I remember, the New Testament seminars that we would have there, they were great places, but they weren't accessible. And I had pushed for space to make the room bigger, because there was literally not even enough space for the people, for able-bodied people coming to the seminar. But people wanted to keep it exclusive. They wanted to keep it tight. And so there was barely enough room to fit a mother with her child, let alone a wheelchair user or someone else who needed a little bit more space. So I think for me, the architectural layer of that in UK universities, of course, there's heritage buildings and all that and types of stuff. But I think if you really are interested in inclusivity in biblical studies, we need to make those spaces not only economically viable and ethical with regards to their career trajectories, but also spatially accessible and inclusive.
Yeah, I think what has been said is really very relevant, particularly Isaac and what Eric has said. I think from my perspective, a main challenge is to identify those mentalities in the field already, the mentalities, the attitudes, these what we would call attitudinal practices that structure our field and our discipline. A lot of it is very subversive. A lot of it is very invisible. There's a very interesting concept that Bruce Carron, I'm sure you would be aware of it. Bruce Carron has developed the notion of author posture. I don't know if you know of the idea of author posture, but it's quite interesting. And I need to give a shout out to one of my colleagues at the University of South Africa, Peter Botha, who has done some interesting work on developing this idea of author posture in relation to disability and also slavery. So Karen understands author posture as this, as it's the compliance, and the compliance of individuals, whether able-bodied or not, to sort of, almost willingly submit to and participate in relations and conditions that hierarchy and authority generate. That's really, and again, I need to recognize my colleague who sort of made me aware of this. I think the first thing is we need to get distance from these required attitudes and mentalities. It sounds very theoretical, but I mean, something very simple would be, for instance, what Candida and Megan Henning did previously with the SBL meeting, and giving us a space to also have an opportunity to also have virtual meetings. So, and it links up with what Eric has said, that we need to really rethink about the conceptual and structural changes in our discipline. What counts as a research output? In South Africa, that's the main thing, because we get subsidized per research output. It means you get money, and our departments survive because of government subsidy for research outputs. But for instance, an academic audiobook you would have to really fight hard and motivate something like that to be a sort of an acceptable and a compliant research output. And now I'm not talking about writing a book and having it transformed into an audiobook, because that's not enough. We should not simply accommodate. We should not simply try to always comply with these author posture, with the dominant author posture. We need to resist that a little bit and think differently about how we disseminate our research, how we disseminate our findings in terms of something, you know, I mean, it's expected in meetings and conferences that you stand in front of a podium in front of a lot of people and you speak. But just think about all the mentalities behind that. And Isaac, you were saying climbing the stairs at Oxford. I mean, I know those stairs very well. I mean, I have to, if I love attending the SBL, but I need to travel from South Africa to the US. And I love traveling, and I can't wait to travel again. But it's taxing on my body, and I am an able-bodied person. Sitting on the Delta flight from Johannesburg to Atlanta for 16 hours in an economy seat, if I can't do it, it's so difficult for me. I often found myself needing to climb stairs where there is just no other option, you know, because the elevator is not working. So if it's such a challenge for me, yeah, I think we need to really stop complying with certain things, and that's why I really appreciate what Canada and Megan did in terms of the SBL meeting, because we should simply resist as well. It's very important. We need to come to a point where we identify my mentalities and resist.
Thank you so much for those really powerful responses and practical suggestions. I'm not really supposed to be speaking, but I would like to share a story that I think picks up on some of the issues of compliance and the issues of the job market that some of you are raising. When I was in graduate school, I was encouraged to model myself on faculty members, my discursive practices, my behavior, and tacitly encouraged to pretend I was not disabled. And I saw enough faculty members talking about job candidates as, oh, he reminds me of me, as a way of talking about how the academy replicates itself in ways that I think Candace was gesturing to. When I applied for jobs, I was put through this gauntlet, this like physically difficult 3-day gauntlet of meetings that were exceptionally long. And just in order to do that, I had to adjust medications in ways that were extremely dangerous for me, in order to put forward the appearance of being able-bodied. The sort of system conspired to make me do this. And of course, it was a great privilege that I could conceal my invisible disability, that I could do that. But it felt to me like it was important that I do that in order to get this position. And, you know, it's a situation I hope that no one would have to be in again. But I also know that if the situation was corrected, if more rest time was built in, that would benefit not just people with chronic illness, but nursing mothers, people traveling from abroad, as Chris mentioned, universal design, as so many people have said. It's not just for people with disabilities, it's for everyone. And when we talk about disability, and when we've been talking in this group about what's important, I think what's at stake is not just disability, but all of us and the future of our guild. And so I really want to thank you all for participating in this conversation, for sacrificing your own sleep and your own time. It was enormously generous, and I am grateful to the SBL for being willing to spotlight this issue in this way. And I hope that this and the shift to a semi-hybrid conference will just be the beginning of a series of changes that will affect not just SBL, but all of our institutions and the academy at large. So thank you so much for your